teaching snowboarding lessons before I could make it down the hill without face planting. First, I dreaded strapping on my board, but soon after, I realized that I was counting down the weekends until I could ride again. Having no idea how to snowboard, having to learn through constant teaching and training was my way of becoming proficient. Maybe this has happened in your life, being thrown to something new and having to learn through hands-on learning. Did you notice that it was more beneficial to learn this way? That's what happens when we learn actively, rather than by just watching or listening. Now, little did I know then, but teaching snowboarding lessons before I knew how to was active learning. Now you may be wondering, what is active learning? Active learning, according to researchers Charles Bromwell and James Eisen, is doing things and thinking about the things that they're doing. Adding this extra step of doing is what makes active learning truly active. Oftentimes, traditional learning methods are solely passive, like reading a book, listening to a lecture, or watching a video. However, research shows that active, engaged learning, like discussing in groups, problem solving, and even learning a new sport, like snowboarding, leads to deeper understanding, better attention, and higher performance. Most of us think that schools always looked something like this: rows of desks, a teacher in the front, bells ringing every 45 minutes. And while SRDS does this differently, with many teachers implementing innovative classroom setups and drop days every week, this isn't always the case, and many schools still take inspiration from the system that started during the Industrial Revolution, when factory workers were expected to be punctual, obedient, and used to repetitive and mundane tasks. And while this system has evolved, Sir Ken Robinson, an education reformer and former professor, agrees with me, and he says that the 45-minute class periods, the ringing bell signaling transitions, and the standardization of curricula all trace back to an era when factory workers were expected to be prepared by school. So, while this system has evolved, one key feature persists, and that feature is the lecture. Large lectures, often involving students of mixed ages and groups, have one person at the front speaking while everyone else listens. And while there are some benefits to this, like teachers being able to spread information quickly and efficiently to large groups of people while being structured and predictable, there's still an important problem. They're passive. Even this TED Talk is passive, but that doesn't mean that you can't implement what I'm saying into your day-to-day life. So, educational researcher John Dewey has argued from more than a century ago that we need to learn through experience. And he understood something that I learned on the slopes. We learn best by doing, not by watching. But when we compare that to sitting in classrooms silently, it raises an important question. Are we designing schools for efficiency or for real understanding? Statistically speaking, active learning leads to higher attention and lower rates of failure, and students who are actively participating in class often are able to remember information weeks later. A study saw that students in traditional lecture classes were 1.5 times more likely to fail than students learning through methods like problem solving and group discussion. Moreover, of the 225 studies they conducted, the average exam scores improved by about 6% when students were in active learning environments. To put into a real-world example, it's like learning a language. If you try and learn something solely through a textbook, it might be difficult to apply into conversation. Whereas if you learn actively, like speaking with a native of that language, where you're able to be okay with forgetting a sentence or stumbling over a word, you lead to success. Like in life, you may not be comfortable with failing, and you might have to, if you're not learning actively, you might not want to continue. Researchers Steve Eisen the third and Robert and James Kaufman found that students who are actively quizzing themselves met the nose retrieval method could retain information longer. Another method that's helpful with this is the Feynman technique, created by Richard Feynman, a Nobel laureate in physics, who had a four-pronged approach to learning quickly and retaining that knowledge. So his steps were as follows. First step was mapping out your knowledge. So you pick a topic and then you write out everything you know about that topic. The second step is that teach that topic to a 12-year-old, or if you don't have a 12-year-old readily available, you have to write out that information in an easily digestible way. Third step is to review your notes and refine any areas that you're not fully comfortable with or that you don't really understand. And then the last step is to teach it to somebody else without using your notes, and then store your information to look back on later. I've definitely used this technique in my schoolwork, and when I try to study for important tests like finals or APs, I find that this method is really helpful to get me to fully comprehend the information. However, another helpful method is the Socratic method, and this was created by the Greek philosopher Socrates. He believed that having a conversation between students and teachers would lead the students to have more questions and to then further their understanding. So, his method is when teachers ask students thought-provoking questions, that leads to students asking their own questions. And this back and forth opens up new pathways in the minds of students and allows them to have more understanding and to realize things that they might not have understood if they were learning for themselves. Many SRDS teachers implement this, and in classes like AP Literature, where texts can be interpreted in many different ways, this is a really helpful method if you want to be able to learn and to fully understand what you're learning about. I know I've definitely used this in a Socratic seminar on Anna Karenina. Without having this Socratic seminar on Anna Karenina, I wouldn't have been able to realize the connection between actions and locations within the story. Projects are another great way to develop active learning, and schools that implement project-based learning see students who can apply what they learn into real-life scenarios, like building projects, designing solutions, or engaging in debates. It's like baking. Sometimes you have to make adjustments that aren't found in the recipe to have a good end product. I've implemented this in my own life, and there are some times where you end up struggling and you might have some gross tasting cookies in the end. But if you carry on and if you make adjustments that you might not see in the recipe, you're able to succeed. And it's kind of the same thing for life. Oftentimes life throws challenges your way and you may struggle, but pushing through and leading and keeping on will lead to success. Taking small risks build up confidence both academically, like answering a question in class or solving a difficult problem, and in your real life, like taking a shot in a close game. So if you take risks in life, you're going to be able to see yourself improve. And to put into the context of more of a real-world scenario, it's kind of like a soccer game, where passive would just be sitting on the sidelines, but active is really getting in the game and getting experience. I find that if you stick with something, you will see yourself succeed if you truly work for that end goal. And that's kind of what active learning is. So I urge you to start asking questions in school, discussing with your peers, debating, and applying concepts. And maybe try out something new this week, like asking a question in class or teaching a topic to a friend. This is your time to get off the sidelines. You may think that you're a little hesitant to start something new, but I'm sure that if you learn actively and work hard for it, you will be able to see yourself succeed. So, here's my message to you all. Start.